Thank you so much. Um, Thank you so much to Outright for making space for me and allowing me the honor of speaking to you all today. I'm super nervous. I don't know how to start thanking everyone here for the work you've been doing and the work I hope you will continue to do to produce, ensure, and safeguard queer and trans futurities. I should start by acknowledging that I'm currently living in Philadelphia on occupied land that belongs to the Lenni Lenape tribes of the greater Delaware region. And as a trigger warning, I will be talking about mental health, anti-Blackness, suicide, and substance abuse. We live in a time where air or breath as a collective life force has come into sharp focus like never before, be it through the respiratory virus that has forced us all indoors, through the murderous asphyxiation of George Floyd that brought forth a global reckoning with the race war waged by structural whiteness on Black bodies throughout the world, or through the intersection of those two. As vulnerable communities at the cusps of racial, gendered, and class disenfranchisement disproportionately fell victim to the COVID pandemic, with Black communities in the US being 2.5 times more likely to contract COVID. Mental health has also become a particularly salient issue under the pandemic. As the virus brought the necropolitics of contemporary neoliberalism to the forefront of public consciousness, sucking life and health out of Black and brown bodies in the name of maintaining a healthy economy, the mantra that kept resurfacing on the lips of conservatives trying to justify reopening the marketplace was that the failure of our economy would surely produce more death. The reasons these people cited were numerous, but generally fell under two categories. The first category was stuff related to direct economic issues, as an economic recession became equated with a purportedly inevitable spread of poverty in the public imagination. So for example, people would die because they would starve, or people would die because they wouldn't be able to afford healthcare and so on. All of which could be easily remedied by regulating the hoarding of wealth by our 1%. Allow me to digress for a second just to point out that this is particularly ironic here in the US, where the decline in average life expectancy documented by the Kaiser Family Foundation over the last 6 years has been primarily associated with wealth hoarding and income disparity by various analysts. But the second category of arguments is where things became much more interesting. As data propagated about an alarming increase in mental health crises around the world, people quickly began to discuss the impact of an economic recession on mental health. Simplistically speaking, the argument was basically this: if we don't open the marketplace, a lot of people are going to die because the economic crisis will lead to mental health issues, which will lead to suicide. The reason I bring this up is because in its own twisted way, this has provided us with a previously impossible opportunity to highlight that mental health is a shared structural problem that can only be remedied through collective action. In other words, if you think an economic recession needs to be avoided to avoid a mental health epidemic, then you understand that mental health is not a question of simply pathologizing individual conditions, that depression and anxiety are not diagnoses given to people who have arbitrarily lost some sort of genetic lottery, but rather that that very logic is a way of mystifying structural inequity and moving the locus of responsibility away from the shared and into the bodies of those most disenfranchised by the shared. Perhaps this is grasping at straws, but it feels like one possible portal through which we can travel towards a not yet here of intersectional justice through the current spectacle of mental health awareness. Earlier this year, a woman named Sara Higazi, a communist, feminist, anti-racist, and queer liberationist, died by suicide. This happened 3 years after she received asylum in Canada, having been forced to move there to flee further political persecution by the Egyptian state and its vicious security apparatus, because she had the courage to raise a rainbow flag in solidarity during my last concert in Egypt, which resulted in her detainment for 3 months, during which she was repeatedly tortured and abused by the Egyptian state. As news of her passage spread around the world, too many were quick to point out mental illness and her depression. But pathologizing mental illness does nothing to explain why some of us are afflicted and others are not. Mental illness does not exist in a void. It is a product of structural violence. The power of heteropatriarchal white supremacist capitalism is the way it inhabits the body. We are born into trauma, and we carry it with us wherever we go. Minorities show higher death rates in every kind of natural death. We have higher rates of diabetes, heart disease, respiratory failure, cancer, anything, you name it. That is what trauma does to the body. That is what hate does to the body. This has been thoroughly documented by the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, and you can find the details of that ongoing study on the CDC website. The thought that someone like Sara can leave a society that keeps trying to kill them and still carry that society inside them, still be moved to taking their own lives, chills me to the bone. as I reflect on my own exile and the exile of the people I love. We spend the first part of our lives demanding air in our homelands, and then we leave to countries where we are promised air, only to find out that we were robbed of lungs. Death by suicide and death by substance or steroid abuse, which have pertinently been labeled deaths of despair, are all too prevalent in our communities. Mental health is an anti-ableist issue. It is a feminist issue. It is a socialist issue. It is an anti-racist issue. It is an anti-imperialist issue. It is a climate justice issue. It is a queer liberationist issue. Mental health is a community issue. My own battle with mental health has been one surface of contact through which I connect to my audience. I've shared my history with eating disorders, PTSD, depression, sexual trauma, and generalized anxiety with my audience whenever possible. I am a recovering alcoholic and addict. At the height of my career in a Middle Eastern boy band, I was constantly either drunk or under the influence. I wanted nothing more than to be less conscious, less present in my body and its trauma, less alive. Towards the end of my drinking career, I often found myself getting completely wasted and intentionally getting behind the wheel of my car, speeding down Lebanon's highways and thinking to myself, hey, if I die, I die. I don't know how or why I survived that or how I managed not to hurt other people in the process, but I've been sober for 2.5 years now. I say this because I think that what I've learned through getting sober is something we can all use, especially now. Addiction is always a person's best attempt to survive when it feels like there are no other means at their disposal. It's impossible to treat addiction without treating anxiety, depression, PTSD, rage, and various other mental health issues. In sobriety, we're told to share our struggles, our joys, and our deepest burning secrets with other addicts. And while the act of unloading that burden is in itself palliative, the most notable outcome of that telling is community. When we allow people to bear witness to our struggle, we create family. We treat addiction with community. I quickly learned that the opposite of despair is not happiness, it is community. A truth that I suspect perhaps undergirds all of us being here today. Our fight for justice and equity is at its core a fight for community and a fight through community. Resilience is a community. This year, armed with its distribution of isolation, has been undebatably exceptional in its distribution of despair. But at every turn, we've witnessed the power of community. We saw more than 1,600 people come together for this year's OutSummit. We saw people around the entire globe organize vigils for Sarah Higazi, letting young queers around the Arab world know that they are loved. We saw communities come together to fight the pandemic and a world work together to find a vaccine. We saw protests all over the world in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, demanding an end to systemic anti-Blackness. We saw 15,000 people march through Brooklyn to demand justice for trans Black lives. We saw people organizing to raise money for bail funds around the US, bringing prison abolitionism into mainstream conversation like never before. We saw people around the world come together to raise money for Beirut after the criminal negligence of the Lebanese state resulted in the port explosion on the 4th of August. And I'll put a link in the chat in a second to a fundraising effort by Outright International. But we saw, and we saw, and we saw, and we saw. In my own life, community has always saved me. As a child who was visibly gender nonconforming, I was bullied every day, often violently, with virtually nowhere to claim sanctuary. As I became increasingly aware of my gender and sexual non-normativity, the absence of positive media representation constantly reinforced my sense of perpetual otherness and alienation. The Arab media landscape of the 1990s was one where gender diversity and sexual diversity were either completely erased or sensationalized as scapegoats for all of society's ills, or at best, we were treated as punchlines for comedy shows building audiences through our exclusion. What saved me, and I don't use that word lightly, was community. A song by White Town that came to embody my gender dysphoria. A picture of Kurt Cobain in a dress. A picture of Bowie in full makeup. Willow from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. James Baldwin, Adrian Rich, Allen Ginsberg, Oscar Wilde, Rabbi Alamuddin all became what I imagined to be my community. Sure, these are people that would never know I exist, but it was something. It was a promise that I wasn't alone. And that was what stopped me from succumbing to despair. In college, I finally found physical community, carried on the shoulders of the fierce guardians who started Lebanon's first LGBTIQA+ organization. I came out. As my career took off, I became the Arab world's first openly queer musician, and my band became a source of imagined community for queer teenagers all around the region. My career has been a constant battle for breath. We've been banned, arrested, attacked, fatwa'd, and excluded at every turn. We gained access to the stage in spite of my queerness, not because of it, and only managed to do that because of community. Through every obstacle, we have been carried to safety by countless trans and queer voices, many of them watching us today. That is the power of community. Sorry. All it took for me to find community, create community, and affect change was to sing. To sing is to breathe. Granted, it is to breathe with intention and control, but it's just that. I breathe for a living. I make a spectacle of breath. All it took for me to find community, create community, and affect change was to breathe with intention. And so if you'll humor me just a bit further, I'd like to end this with a minute of intentional breathing. I realize this sounds a little granola, but I think we could all use a minute to breathe together as we reflect on the communities we breathe with. I can't see you, so I'm just going to trust that you're going to close your eyes and breathe with me while I use my best ASMR voice and turn off my camera. Close your eyes. Take a deep breath. Hold it in for 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3. Now exhale. Take a deep breath. Tell yourself that for the next 60 seconds, all you need to be doing is to breathe. Now exhale. Inhale. As you draw breath from that shared life force, feel it fill your body with vitality. Now exhale. Inhale. Remember that you are able to breathe because of the gifts given to us by our queer and trans ancestors and foreparents. Now exhale. Inhale. Remember that what we exhale, someone else will inhale. Now exhale. Take a deep breath. Remember that we are all bodies fighting for breath, and that we can't be together as bodies in a room, we can breathe together. Now exhale. Take a deep breath. Recognize that the work you've been doing has made an impact on countless lives, and that those lives will in turn produce immeasurable change. Now exhale. Take a deep breath. Remember that you deserve it. Now exhale. Thank you so much for bearing with me. This has been such an honor. God bless. Have a good one. Thank you.